Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. This is Firoz Manji from Daraja Press. And welcome to Organizing in the Time of COVID. I noticed my name, I've got People's Strike. Well, that was because last week I was hosting a whole day session for People's Strike. But I'm not, this program is not associated with that. So I'm just going to be ask your forgiveness and we'll modify that Daraja Press aspect later on. I'm really pleased today to be introducing my guest, Dr. Alexandra Gabbard, a professor of English literature whose research focuses on cross-cultural fields of cultural studies, queer theory, gender studies, feminist studies, posthumanist theory, new materialism, body politics, psychoanalytic theory, and so on. She has a degree, PhD degree in contemporary politics and literature in 2017. And the main part of her work has been on maternity, sorority, matricide, under the aegis of a feminist psychoanalysis, body and gender politics, and reconceptions of feminine genealogy. I want to welcome you, Alexandra. Alex, do you prefer, or
Alex is fine, or Alexandra.
Alexandra? Let's use your full name. But welcome to the show. It's really
Thank
nice to have you. Yeah. I should explain that I came across Alexandra when we were both panelists on the Global Center for Advanced Studies discussion, and I was really struck by Alexandra's perception and understanding of the nature of Brazil and the rising fascism, and in particular in the time of COVID. So I wonder if you could sort of give us some sort of understanding. For imagine that many of the people watching this may not know a great deal about Brazil and the rise of Bolsonaro and the consequences of the defeat of the Workers' Party and so on. So
yes.
Perhaps I could say to you, what was your reaction to the rise of Bolsonaro? What brought it about, and what does the COVID reveal under these situations?
Yes. Ferenzi, I just get goosebumps when you ask me about my reaction to the rise of Bolsonaro, who has been called Tropical Hitler. His nicknames are frequently Bolsonazi or Bolsolini, because he's frequently quoting him and his ministers, Mussolini and Hitler and other fascist figures in their speeches, and even Trump on steroids, kind of like a worse Trump. Can you imagine that? But I was just devastated. Talking to some friends, I remember that I'm not a person very prone to emotional reactions. I go more to the logical side of things. I try to. And the next day, the day after he won the elections, I just sat down and I wept. I wept for hours, sobbing, just having this existential crisis that 54% of the voters in Brazil had elected this grotesque figure to represent our country. So for those of you that do not know a lot about Brazilian history, I would say that we have three pillars to form this idea of a Brazil, which is very colonialist. We nowadays, if you go to academia and you hear people in Europe, they're still talking about post-colonialism, while the thinkers here are talking about decolonialism. And I would say that most of the Brazilian citizens do not even understand how we are still under a colonized mentality. So I would say that, this adoration, Eurocentric adoration, the inheritance of slavery, which it has not been recognized, and the inheritance of, authoritarian governments, which the last one we had, the last military dictatorship, we had from 1964 to 1984, and the non-recognition of that, not doing a mea culpa from this last military dictatorship that was based on terror and torture and persecution, is what led to Bolsonaro, because unlike Germany, who went through this very painful, that it partly went through this very painful process of recognizing what happened in the Second World War, I would say that Brazilian government has never recognized. We do not have a museum that in relation to some recognition of dictatorship. I've been to Argentina, to Chile, and Uruguay, and they all have institutions, this memorial of to make people think about what the dictatorship was like. We do not have such an institution in Brazil, which is a country that is a continent. So not finding any kind of memorial in relation to this is quite significant.
But isn't that part of the sort of silences of Brazil? More than 50% of the population of Brazil are of African origin, but yet everyone looks at Brazil as a basically European, Eurocentric institution.
Yes. Most Brazilians will tell you that they do not think they are racist, but we actually, for me, like we had a law, 1996 or 98, I have to check, in which domestic maids, they were forced to use the service elevator, and the buildings would not allow them to use the front elevator, right? That's what we call the social elevator. And we needed a law in Congress to say that this was interfering with basic human dignity, and that anyone, independent of their status or their job, can use any of the elevators. So you can imagine, we have a classic image. I'll send this to Firenze later, where it's the Brazilian family, right? So it's like the elitist family, supporters of Bolsonaro. They are wearing the Brazilian national soccer team shirt, yellow and green. So you've got mommy and daddy, heteronormative, their kids, and you've got the nanny. And of course, the nanny is wearing white, and she is 95% of the times a person of color, right? So this is very significant. But, because we don't have, people don't have basic literacy, only 33% of Brazilians have ever bought a book. Only 33% Brazilians, 44% of Brazilians admit that they do not read. And out of this 1/3 of the population who has bought a book, it's like 60%, it was the Bible, of them bought the Christian Bible. So people do not have basic, literacy skills, much less, semiotics or any kind of critical thinking to look at images and deconstruct them, or to look, as I was talking to Professor Firenze, at a restaurant, at the best restaurants in, the best areas in the city, and look at them and say, that's interesting. All the customers are white and all the servants are black. Isn't that, highly relevant? I would say that most people either do not have a trained eye for this because they never had the opportunity to, and a minority just chose to, blind themselves because they do not want to question their privileges.
So tell us more about now there's this neo-fascist government, I guess, in power. So how does that affect people? I mean, in what way would it be right to call them neo-fascist? What does it mean?
Well, you have to think, you have to look at, every time you look at especially a public figure, especially a politician, at their biography. So Bolsonaro has this very interesting biography where he puts himself as kind of like this figure that is at the margins, that is not understood, that he's very aggressive and violent in his discourse, but he's kind of a guy that tells things like it is. So he was part of the military government, right? He was a lieutenant in the army during our military dictatorship, and he actually stages a coup against the military, the army organization, fighting for a rise in salaries of the lower ranking officials. So he was going to stage this coup, very much what would be considered probably at the time a terrorist attack by the military government, a failed coup where he was going to blow up, water plants in the city of Rio de Janeiro, and the city was going to be without water, as a form of protest for a raise in a lower ranking official salary. So he gets forcefully disconnected, right? So they terminate his relationship to the army, and he uses this discourse as, this figure from the margins, this misunderstood man who is just fighting for the rights of the people, but is actually, very much his colleagues in the army, and he gets elected as a city councilor for Rio de Janeiro. And just, promoting this hate speech against very misogynist, racist, against minorities. One of his slogans is that a good bandit is a dead bandit. So his solution for solving our problems of urban violence is just to, kill whatever criminals have engaged in criminal activity. And he quickly rises to state congressman and federal congressman. And before he became a president, he was a federal congressman for 30 years. And he had 2 laws that were approved. He was only able to fabricate 2 laws that are completely irrelevant. One of them is approving some kind of like alternative medication for cancer, which has already been, put aside by scientists, which is not effective. And so he has this totally irrelevant performance as a public man in the Congress, not even for the military segment, which he was supposed to be defending. But at the same time, he comes from being this figure of fringe figure of discourse. One of our presidents in the 90s, a neoliberal figure we had, Fernando Henrique, he even says at the time, 96, 98, in public, on the morning TV news, that Fernando Henrique should be, put up against the wall and shot to death, like, military killing squad. And this brutality of his discourse, just, people start to normatize it, and it starts becoming more and more accepted. While at the same time, I think it validates that microfascism, right, which people in this very conservative, racist, misogynist country that we live in, he really is kind of like after a time of the labor government. So we have, just to go back in the timeline, end of the dictatorship in 1984, military government, beginning of the new democracy, right? So it's a big confusion in the 80s. Our economy is a disaster because of the inheritance of the military government. Inflation rises in the end of the 80s until 1992 to levels that are higher than Germany in the Second World War. So, like you would, I remember this as a child, you go to the supermarket and the next day things were 300% more expensive. So people were stocking, products because maybe you wouldn't find anything to eat. Then we have a neoliberal figure, Fernando Henrique, who comes from a discourse of social democracy. That's a talk for another time, but a social democracy in Brazil is very much center-right, differently from what happens in Europe. And Fernando Henrique is called the prince of the privatizations. He privatized everything he could and sold off Brazil, to foreign countries. And then we've got the rise of, people got angry about that. And then we got the rise of the labor government. So then we've got Lula, as a president elected in 2002. He goes on for 2 mandates. And then we've got his successor, which is Dilma, who is impeached in what most people recognize nowadays as a coup. And during the labor movement, they did some, they're not above criticism. There's a lot of things to say about them, especially nowadays with lots of corruption that was found, amongst the party. But, you gotta give them what they did right. And that is investment in education, offering credit to Brazil in general so that a huge amount of the population was able to rise, families come out of misery. And you've got poor people at universities, poor people getting, financing from banks to go study at private universities, Black people graduating as doctors, as engineers. And that caused the social mobility that really infuriated this dominating class, which is, of white, patriarchal, colonialist, people. the 1% here in Brazil. And they started doing everything that they could, to destroy the labor government. And because of these attacks on the labor government with fake news, with specialists on internet militia, digital militia like Steve Bannon and Cambridge Analytics, just bombarding the labor government all the time. And through what we call nowadays legal warfare, they basically were able to destroy, the party and impeach the last labor president, our first woman president, Dilma Rousseff. And this transition went on her vice president, which was within the coup to, depose her. He set up the stage for Bolsonaro, right? So Bolsonaro comes from this figure of 30 years of total, irrelevance in Congress, but becoming very popular on internet and TV shows by saying all these horrible, degrading and offensive things, and by glorifying torture, for example. And he uses of his parliamentary immunity to say these things, because if he was just, a common citizen saying these things, he could be sued and he could suffer a legal penalty. For him, until finally he's elected the president, with support from Steve Bannon and Trump and, all those people that want extreme Orbán. So his son has close ties to, Orbán from Hungary and Erdogan from Turkey. And they are also, the family also, the Bolsonaro family, his 3 sons have a career in politics as well. So now his most powerful son is a federal congressman. He's got another son who's in the Senate. And the 3rd son is in a city council in Rio de Janeiro. And all investigations that the federal police are undertaking in relation to the family, especially the oldest son, who is the senator, show clear connections to the Rio militia. So they are part of this, highly probable that they are part of this criminal organization, which rules Rio de Janeiro, which rules drug traffic, which rules the lives of what we call favelas, which are the peripheries of Rio, where have millions of people, primarily Black people living in inhuman conditions.
So to talk about what it means for ordinary people in these favelas, what it means for Black people in Brazil.
Yes.
What's their perspective? What are they suffering? What is the situation?
Yes. Well, currently we do not have a health minister, because all the previous 2 health ministers that we had confronted Bolsonaro, even though they were part of his party and of his ideology. But they reached a point where they could not compactuate with his anti-scientificism. Like he wanted to, legalize hydrochloroquine as a solution for COVID. And the ministers were doctors, and they said no. So he fired them. So currently we do not have a health minister. We've got an interim minister who is a general, but his specialty is in logistics. He knows nothing about, health, whether private or public health. And so the country is chaos, and we've got different states with different governors and different mentalities. So some of the governors, are being responsible and imposing the quarantine. And some of the governors have this discourse of we have to open up commerce or else our economy is going to crash even more. And in the front line of this political infighting are poor people, right? Poor people that live, so you've got, for example, in the favelas, you've got people living in like 10 square meters, a family of 7 people. How are they going to be able to do, social isolation? And, sometimes they don't have enough money. The other day, we had the news article on this very poor old Black woman from this poor community that she, you wanted to cry. The journalists were almost crying in the interview. She said she only had money to buy 2 bars of soap a month. So how is she going to sterilize her hands, and wash them? And besides that, our public health system, we've got, I would say, a health system with many flaws, but it is public, it is universal and free for any Brazilian citizen. And that's much more than we can say about the USA. But once we've got those beds, these hospital beds are nearly reaching the limit, and what are we going to do with the rest, of the people who get sick? So most Brazilians do not have money to afford a private health plan, so they depend upon public health security. And I'm not, that's not to mention, for example, homeless people, right? You just take a look around, walk around any city, big city in Brazil, you're going to see a lot of homeless people, most of them Black, unfortunately, a lot of women, some children too, and they have, they're just lying in the streets, totally at, risk of urban violence and COVID. And they probably don't even have IDs, so they're not going to be able to register into the hospital, perhaps, if they get sick. And aside from that, we've got a huge political problem, a huge social problem, which is medieval in its core, where our country, Brazil, has 220 million people, and 30 million people do not have clean water or sewage. So it makes, again, impossible to have the basic hygiene to, safeguard yourself against COVID if you can't wash your hands, right, if you can't take a shower, if the sewage is just, in the favelas, we've got open sewers on the streets, and people that don't have enough money to buy a bar of soap, so they do not even have that, basic capacity of cleaning their hands. So it's a disaster. And while that the government is just with this discourse that, they basically, all they haven't said is that the COVID is false, So they have said that, it's not that bad. The president refused to sign the law proposed by the Congress where it's obligatory for, wearing masks in public. So the president refused to sign this law and take it forward. And then again, that's a whole other issue for impoverished people. Do they have money to buy masks? They probably don't if they do not have enough money to buy soap. So we're looking at, thousands of deaths, which once again, in Brazil, it's always a Black genocide. People that are working, that are exposing themselves, providing these, basic services like supermarkets and all that, they're usually young Black delivery men, are young Black men. We had a strike, an app strike last Wednesday, actually, where we had this movement of like not using the apps, do not order Uber Eats or do not order any kind of online delivery, because these companies are not offering these young Black men who are from 18, 25, their age group, the basic conditions of safety, like alcohol to sterilize their hands, masks. They do not even get a bathroom break. Sometimes they say, we do not have time to go to the bathroom, because we're working all day long to make, these like minimum wage that will not even perhaps pay their bills at the end of the month.
So they are the primary people who are being infected and who are being killed. I mean, we're talking about nearly 65,000 deaths
yes.
already.
Firoze, we do not, I'm assuming, because always in Brazil, it comes to a thing, it's always a Black genocide. Everything's connected to Black genocide. But in reality, because we have a fascist government, I don't know if you are aware of this, but he forbade the health ministry to release the numbers. And he's doing everything that he can to alter, and doctor the numbers. So the information we are relying on is that the major press agencies, for the first time in Brazilian history, as some who were like great rivals, they have come together in this coalition to exchange data and be able to publish by investigative journalism the numbers. So we do not have government numbers. We have, investigative journalism numbers, because the government, this fascist, nearly dictatorship, we're nearly in a dictatorship again, is refusing to publish the real numbers, right?
Right. And I mean, what impact does this regime had on working people in terms of organizing, in terms of trade unions, in terms of which was quite well developed in Lula's time?
Yes. Lula comes from, right, the union workers tradition, and we have very strong unions in here, and worker unions. And I've heard some neoliberals, they complain about Brazil because they say we are the country with the highest number of like labor lawsuits in the world. But then again, that's because we have a specific set of laws for labor, and we have this jurisdiction for labor law, right? So we have ministries in the states that are just for labor lawsuits. And one of the first things that Bolsonaro did when he entered the government was to extinguish the Ministry of Labor, right? So he extinguished the Ministry of Labor back in when he assumed the presidency in the beginning of 2019. And this basically, we've got now the state efforts over that time for looking into, this workers' issues, a generation of new, jobs and guaranteeing their rights, but total, exemption of the federal government. In fact, after Dilma's, the last Labor president's impeachment, the interim president between Bolsonaro and Dilma, which was her vice president, part of the gang that took Dilma out from power, they imploded the very solid labor rights constitution that we had for Brazilian workers. So, for example, every Brazilian worker that's officially registered has the right for 30 days vacation a year. They have the right. The company has to give these workers 30 days vacation a year. And Brazilian workers also have the right for a Christmas compensation. So at the end of the year, they get what we call a 13th salary, which is an extra salary to compensate for the taxes they're paying throughout the year. And they also have, unemployment benefits if they happen to be fired. And Bolsonaro and his team of, Chicago U neoliberals are trying to end with all that and just say kind of like, oh no, you can talk to your employer and you guys you make a friendly contract where you decide on your rights. But then if you think about, this huge population that didn't have access to education, that doesn't read, and has no political knowledge at all, how are these poor women coming from these, fringe communities going to negotiate with their employers what their basic rights are in our end? So this is what it means. I think Bolsonaro extinguishing the labor ministry is the, concrete symbolism that he wants to destroy all of this social, movement we had in the guaranteeing labor rights in Brazil. And by doing that, for example, they've just signed this temporary law where employers could reduce the working hours of their employees if they wish not to fire them. So that's up for a whole new discussion. If you take any prosecutor that works with labor rights in Brazil, they're going to probably argue against it. So either you fire the worker because then they will be entitled for a time of support of unemployment checks, or you keep them with their full benefits. And this current government, they want to benefit the banks and, the elite. They are not interested in securing fair labor rights for the majority of the population, right? So, yeah.
Well, Brazil has one of the largest surviving indigenous communities. And there's already much in the newspaper about the Amazon being eroded by corporations with the support of Bolsonaro, etc. Yeah. How has COVID been affecting this population?
I would say that in relation to the indigenous people, once again, unfortunately, we have to use the word genocide. So they do not, historically, they do not have, biological defenses to stand against, all of these diseases and infections brought by non-indigenous people. And they are living, in isolated communities. So they do not have access to, a health center that's close by. So in relation to the population that we have, the indigenous people right now, we have a huge number of deaths. And they also, are in these insular communities. So it's very hard for them to do social isolation as well. So that's going to spell out, a humanitarian disaster. And in relation to the deforestation and destruction of nature, we've got agribusiness mainly. taking advantage of this and taking advantage of how focused the media is right now on reporting, COVID and these political strikes, which the president insists, our fascist president insists to create, because that a fascist always needs an enemy, right? If he doesn't create an enemy, then he doesn't have a reason to be in power. So because the attention is a little bit drawn away from that, not that there was ever enough attention on this matter anyways, but right now it's particularly, overshadowed. The agro business companies and, politicians that are associated with them are just devastating kilometers, of green areas, especially in the Amazonian area. And that, is just going to contribute more to global warming. And we're at numbers since 2019 that have never been seen in Brazil. So then again, that's another disaster that affects the whole world, right? So the only movement that I've seen towards this are, again, powerful neoliberal companies that are now, big time investors in Wall Street, bankers making a boycott. They were the ones that, got together recently about 2 weeks ago, and they wrote a petition again. First time, this is total novelty in Brazilian history, warning the government that if they did not reduce the numbers of deforestation, then they would boycott Brazil. And if you don't believe me, you can just Google it, just check like 2018, green area in the Amazonian region of Brazil and check what it is right now. And you will see this huge area that's been totally destroyed. And the indigenous people are, the frontline protectors of the forests and of the ecology keepers, right? So they are the first, besides the COVID, they are also being murdered, which they historically have been by, agribusiness. So, yes.
And Brazil also had a very strong women's movement. How have they been affected by the rise of fascism and of COVID at the same time?
Yes, well, we've had a spike in the number of domestic violence and domestic violence reports to the police, while families are right now in quarantine. So this patriarchal violence manifests itself in the flesh, right? So we're having enormous numbers. We already, I think, the 5th country in the world which keeps registers of these numbers in feminicide. So feminicide has risen, domestic violence has risen, and other issues that affect, perhaps, if we want to think about patriarchy, and we want to think about queer citizens, and we've got a lot of young queer people being kicked out of their homes and having nowhere to go in the middle of a pandemic, right? And it's just like the validation, right? The validation of the discourse, the fascist discourse, like Trump. Bolsonaro validates, what he argues is that he's in favor of arming Brazil, right? So he's in favor of everyone having the legal right to own a gun. And then he argues that women can get a gun too, so if they want to protect themselves. And so basically he's sponsoring a bloodbath, right? So think about it as a woman, right? That is in a relationship within a patriarchal system that's totally abusive towards women. You're going to carry a gun and you're going to murder your partner, right? You're going to shoot your partner or threaten him with it. So that's our president's once again solution for it, So again, it's a huge step backwards in relation to empowerment. But at the same time, I have to say that the new generations of women, especially with access of information in the internet, are much more well-informed about violence and about, sexism than my generation ever was. So we also see, teenagers who are much more empowered, that will get together to protect each other whenever we have violence on the street, that will try to form, communities of support when domestic violence is happening at home, right, as well. So there's this side that's a little bit redeeming in all of this, horrible situation.
Yes, I mean, to discuss more the sort of redeeming features. What level of organizing, social organizing, what kind of political organizing is possible under these present conditions? Where are the elements of hope, even if they are merely cracks that let the light in?
Yes, I think that the cyber activism, as ethereal as it sounds, right, is a real possibility, especially because younger generations have a relationship with online communication, that has good and bad sides to it as well, but they know how to use it in a much more native way than older people do. So they feel comfortable, getting together in these online collectives and organizing manifestations, kind of like here we have what we call a panelaço, which is a pan banging, so then you have panelaços against the president. So, the word gets around and you end up, if you don't see it in your social media, you end up getting messages from friends at this time, at this hour, everybody's banging their pans on the windows as a manifestation against Bolsonaro. And then, the journalists, of course, will compute this and they kind of like run some data. But then again, it's connected to the big media, right? If you want to think about more organic support, I think it is, access to education. And we have a lot of, very interesting professors that are now offering courses online for free for students, for anyone who wants to take it. So like academic writing, we've got lots and lots of courses on fascism, on the dictatorship in Brazil, why and how it happened, understand your history, talking about, civil rights, so the Black movement in Brazil for civil rights, and the feminist movement and the queer movement. So also this other facet of like free education online. So go educate yourself. I think that's another, go read. You've got free articles online that weren't possible before because perhaps people probably didn't have money to buy books. So now you can, you have professors offering this information for free, where you can, if you are privileged enough, of course, to have access to the internet, because there are a lot of people in Brazil that do not have, the minimum financial capacity to be able to have an internet connection. So if I think if you know someone who doesn't have that, you can offer them, you can print the article for them and offer it as a reading, or you can show them, right, the video on your cell phone if they do not have 4G. Like, oh, look at this is so interesting. And just what I guess this we're calling now the politics of affection, a lot connected to Paulo Freire's idea and to the feminist movement and the queer movement especially, which is the politics of affection, to understand that the other is suffering, to not, let yourself be carried away also by this micro-fascism, right? By this anger against, because perhaps, people that voted for Bolsonaro, some of them, they're not going to be convinced. He has his hardcore fans, which are perverse and they revile, right, in his cruelty. But there are people that were just convinced, by the mediatic movement at the time that the labor government was the villain. And with a little bit, of affection and conversation and discourse, I still want to believe as an educator that we can bring them, to a minimum sense of humanitarian consideration for the other, to have a little bit of empathy, perhaps politics of affection, empathy, education, I think are the good things that came with the new digital era.
But you've been working in literature, so tell me about what is happening in contemporary literature in Brazil that is laying the basis for organizing, for opposition, for giving expression to the politics of affection. I mean, there are people like Sergio Rodriguez, Adriana Lisboa, and so on. I mean, there's a long tradition of literature. What's happening today?
I think that literature has always been the space of disruption, where you would bring, make people question a little bit the status quo and, get out of their comfort zone and their own beliefs. But I would say that most recently, besides the idea of fictional literature, we have a lot more Brazilians, more than ever, after, I can even include myself, after Bolsonaro came into power, and it was that existential crisis for a lot of people, and we're thinking like, how could this happen, right? like that shock value that you had of how could people in my family vote for this guy who's a monster, and then kind of like breathing and calming yourself and saying, it's not, he didn't come out of nowhere, and we have to understand a little bit more of politics. So I think that people are becoming much more interested now in the idea of like a basic political education, right? And we've got a lot of progressive and left-wing people involved in politics that bring this idea of politics of affection. So, for example, an interesting movement that we had in our last elections, the city hall elections, which were 2016, was what they called gabinetona, or if we translate it into English, was like we got a lot of progressive people, so women, queer people, trans people, black, that are part of the queer community, and black women that came together in this one huge coalition, and they all ran for the same party, and they agreed that whoever won, if one of them won, it was going to be a collective governance, right? So we had that here in Belo Horizonte with Aurea Carolina was elected a city councilor, and from city councilor in 2018, she was elected federal congresswoman, and she is in direct contact to the communities from Rio and Belo Horizonte, and they are all thinking about advancing women's rights, human civil rights, humanitarian issues, and just to fight against this fascism. In relation to academics, we've got more people interested in sociology and in history. Like I told you, we have Folha de São Paulo, one of the biggest, most famous media news outlets we have printed still in Brazil. They're offering all kinds of courses on democracy, on fascism, free online, which you can take. And we also got a turn of people going back towards philosophy as a way of dealing with this, existential crisis of like, how could my father vote, for a Bolsonaro, and kind of understand, that this older people, usually it's a profile of older people that are 50 and 60 years old or a little bit older, that they were children and teenagers during the dictatorship. So, they were not allowed to have critical minds because you were afraid to think. Thinking was something bad. Do not question, obey, right? And so this probably, I mean, this is what I do, my personal opinion, but I think this caused in them this inherent violence as well, not being able to externalize anything. And so they just, these time bombs that will explode against anything that they believe is, the ruling power. And I think that's it, Firenze. People, for example, after Bolsonaro won the government, we had the rise, and historically the highest number of visits to museums, because he's been trying to censor art and artists, and he has huge debacles with specific artists, especially performances that involve nudity or anything that is queer or anything that questions Christianity, for example. He claims it's profane, and he makes this big, witch hunt about it. So paradox, we have a higher number of people going to museums. So we have a reaction, and I think that we need to collect this data of more people who are reading, more people that are studying, more people interested in politics. For example, I think it's the first time also in Brazilian history where people know how to name all of the ministers in Supreme Justice Court, even if it is to vilify them. But if you ask people 10 years ago, like, can you name one minister in Supreme Justice Court? They probably wouldn't be able to tell you, and they probably know who's the president and not even the governor. So we have people, even if it is, to be angry, they now understand, like, okay, you voted for this person and they were from this party. So are they fulfilling what they promised that they would do during their campaigns? And is this the best democratic way to do things? So I see a lot of people saying things kind of like, why are we voting for these figures over and over again, the same people? Let's try something new, right? So a greater awareness, perhaps if we want to be Eurocentric, let's at least use the positive things, like, So let's be a political animal, and let's think about, what it is to be a political animal, because it's not separated from our daily lives.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, it's been very, very interesting talking to you, Alexandra. If there was one last message you wanted to convey to people watching this show, what would that be?
I think that with the, dealing with the pain that it is of realizing how many people around you and how many people in your communities in your country are choosing an authoritarian, a fascist regime. I think that the way to combat this is with politics of affection, keeping a little bit our hope up, and offering our friendship and our knowledge to the community as something constructive. So, for example, as a teacher, I believe that, if you can offer a little bit community work and a little bit of your time to some student who needs it, to some student that can learn something, and then within, younger generations are very skillful at spreading knowledge, and at forming communities, that this can have an impact, to educate younger people. And why not even, try to have discussions with older generations, like our parents and grandparents who voted for these Mussolini-like figures, try to bring them back, into the common sense, or else, we cannot give up hope of educating people and of, appealing to their affection, appealing to their empathy.
That's a great, great message. Love will break us through. Huh? Um, Indeed. Just like to say thank you very much,
Thank you,
Alexandra,
Ferenzi,
for
for the
finding
invitation.
time to join us. And I look forward to keeping in touch with you and to
Thank
following
you.
you on your work
Yes.
with the Global Center for Advanced Studies.
Thank you so much.
All the best. Huh?
Thank you. I'll see you later,
Okay.
Ferenzi. Thank you.
Okay. Bye.
Bye-bye.
That was great. That was Alexandra Gabbard from Brazil. Interesting, we ended up on a discussion about the importance of the politics of affection. Well, tomorrow we have a very interesting event taking place, and I hope that you will actually sign in on this. The politics of love and rebellion. We will have some amazing people speaking to us. Margot Okazawa Ray, Roberto Hernandez, Melanie Bush, Robin DJ Kelly, and Trey Freeborn, as well as myself. I hope that you will find time to join us tomorrow on this show, starting at 1:00 p.m. Eastern American time. But thank you for joining us today. This is Firoz Manji from Daraja Press, wishing you a good day.